I think we should make a start because we've got more than 60 people in now, which is brilliant. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's ASH webinar on introducing a tobacco industry levy to make the polluter pay. It's great to see that we've got nearly 150 people signed up for today's session. So hoping to see as many of you as possible coming through, but if not, there will be a recording available after. So I hope everyone gets a chance to engage with this event. For those who I've not met, my name is Sebastian Rees, and I'm the head of health at the Institute for Public Policy Research, the progressive think tank. Over the last few years, we've been running a commission on health and prosperity, which has been arguing that our poor national health doesn't just undermine our collective well-being, it also serves as a brake on our economic progress. We think that building a fairer and more resilient Britain will require a fundamental shift in the way that we approach health. We've called for action on multiple fronts, from improving housing standards to tackling insecure low-paid work. But if the government are serious about turning around the health of the nation, we need much more decisive action on some of our most long-standing public health challenges. It'll be no surprise to anyone on this call to hear that ending smoking once and for all must be a core pillar of a comprehensive public health plan. As you'll all know, smoking is still the leading cause of preventable death and disease in this country and costs society as much as £43.7 billion a year, including £27.5 billion lost economically due to early deaths, reduced employment and lower earnings. And over the last few years, we've made real progress on ending smoking. The tobacco and vapes bill, which I'm sure many people are following very closely, will end smoking for the next generation. And concerted efforts in particular areas, particularly to reduce the number of women smoking during pregnancy, have paid real dividends. But as we all know, there's still a lot to do, and there's particularly a lot to do to support current smokers in making the difficult decision to quit. We know some of the change in that area will come from regulation, but a lot of it will come from sustained investment in services that help people to quit smoking. Unfortunately, we know in the current context that those kind of preventative services are often most at risk when local authority and NHS finances are in a difficult position, which they undoubtedly are right now. So we should be looking for alternative ways to raise revenue to fund those services. And what better way to do that than to raise revenue from those who profit from addiction? The four big tobacco companies in the UK who make an estimated £900 million in the UK every year in profits, while the British taxpayer picks up the tab. Can I get the next slide, please? So the purpose of today's webinar is really to explore what that kind of levy would look like. The IPPR, the organisation I work for, has long supported a levy on tobacco manufacturers. But in today's webinar, we'll be hearing from the real experts on both how a levy would work and the politics involved in implementing it. So the first part of the session, we'll hear from Dr. Rob Branston, who's an associate professor in business economics and co-director of the Tobacco Control Research Group at the University of Bath. And Rob will be explaining exactly how a levy would work in practice and why it's needed. Next, we'll pass on to Hazel Cheeseman, who all of you will know. Hazel is the chief executive at ASH, and she'll be sharing insights on public support for the levy and the political landscape surrounding its implementation. So the first bit's about making the levy work. The second bit's really about the politics of the levy. The final part of today, and we'll hopefully leave plenty of time for Q&A. So please do post your questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to pass them on to our speakers. But yeah, please do keep them coming throughout the session because I'll be looking in real time as it happens. Next slide, please. Before I turn to Rob and Hazel, a few little bits of housekeeping. First thing, as I mentioned at the start, is that this meeting will be recorded and uploaded to the ASH website, and it will be shared after the event with attendees alongside the slides. Second bit of housekeeping is, please can everyone keep themselves muted and their videos turned off unless they're presenting. ASH staff are on the call and they will mute anyone who is unmuted and not presenting, but please do make our jobs easier by doing that yourselves. Third bit is we encourage everyone to submit questions and reflections in the meeting chat. We'll discuss those in the Q&A session, and you'll see at the top of your screen the little chat button. Do click on that and do submit your questions when you hear something interesting or something that you have further reflections on, or any direct questions for the panelists. Final two bits, if you have any other issues, please do post them in the meeting chat, and we'll do our best to help. And if for some reason the chat's not working, do email the email address on screen, which is admin@smokefreeaction.org.uk. Final one is if you have any technical issues, we do suggest checking your meeting settings, making sure that you have the right audio and microphone selected. I was called out on that earlier today, so I'm well aware. So please do that. And if all else fails, do leave and rejoin the meeting, and hopefully that will help. So a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to pass on to Rob to discuss how a levy on tobacco would work.
Good afternoon, everybody. For those who don't know me, thank you for the introduction, Sebastian. But just to clarify, I'm Rob Branston from the University of Bath. Next slide, please. And before I talk to you about the rationale for the levy and how the sort of levy scheme would work, I would like to make some declarations of potential conflicts of interest. And in particular, I just want to flag firstly that I am funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies to work on tobacco control issues, as are my colleagues at the Tobacco Control Research Group. And I would also flag that I do own 10 shares in Imperial Brands, the tobacco company, so that I can attend their annual general meeting and ask some sort of questions about their operations to aid in the academic research that I do. I don't have any financial interest. Any money we get via dividends is donated to health-related charities. And then finally, if you want any more information on the funding policy of the Tobacco Control Research Group, or indeed the projects we're currently working on, please do have a look at the links I've put on the screen there. Next slide, please. To explain how the polluter pays levy scheme would work and how it would function, I think we first of all need to start on the actual rationale for the levy scheme in the first place. And here, as we already heard from Sebastian's introduction, I think it's fair to say the UK is an internationally leading country when it comes to tobacco control. We don't just have the forthcoming tobacco and vapes bill, but actually we have many decades of experience to show how the UK has introduced a variety of different tobacco control measures, from bans on advertising to very high tobacco taxation. But ultimately, the job is not done. Even if the tobacco and vapes bill comes into law, as we all hope, the job is still not done because millions continue to use tobacco products, and that comes at the cost of tens of thousands of lives lost every year, and as we've already heard, tens of billions of pounds in cost to the British economy every year. So we can and should do more to address tobacco use. The polluter pays levy scheme that we are proposing would address a number of particular issues that we can observe in the tobacco market at the moment. To start with, we know the UK has very high tobacco taxation, and tobacco taxation is the leading strategy that we can use to deter tobacco use. But unfortunately, we know the tobacco industry is very good at undermining the impact of tobacco taxation through the use of clever pricing strategies. We can see that in a very simple way, in the fact that you can go into a shop at the moment in the UK and buy 20 cigarettes, and the cost of that will range from the cheapest brands at about £12.40 to the most expensive brands at about £18.80. In other words, this tells us that the industry is very good at using different selling points in the marketplace in order to balance making tobacco affordable and attractive to people with also generating profits for the industry. And that profit should not be underestimated. The tobacco industry is still able to earn a huge amount of profit from selling tobacco in the UK and actually pays very little profit on that taxation. We are all under the impression, I think, that because of high tobacco taxes, the industry pays a lot towards the harm it causes. But actually, those tobacco taxes are passed on to consumers in the form of higher retail prices, and the industry itself is able to earn a large amount of profit. And that stands in stark contrast to the fact that funding for tobacco control, as I'm sure many of you know firsthand, is in short supply. And indeed, we know the government more generally is short of money for all of the things it would like to prioritise. So in other words, if we are to address tobacco going forward, we need policies that address the profitability of the industry's use of price as a selling tactic, and in particular, the way they can use price to undermine tobacco taxation. And if we do both of those two things, we will make a meaningful dent in the ability to sell tobacco in the UK. Now, the polluter pays levy scheme that we are going to propose speaks to both of these two things, but we do need to recognise there are other policy options out there. We could, for example, look to deploy a policy of minimum retail price in the way that they have a minimal retail price for alcohol in Scotland. Those other policy options do go some way to addressing the issues that I have identified, but none of them do so to the same extent and have the wider benefits that we would get from a polluter pays levy scheme. And so that is why we have suggested this as a particular tactic, because it speaks to the issues that we observe in the tobacco market at the moment. Next slide, please. To put the issue in context, I think it is worth just reflecting on the size of the profits that the industry is making. We heard from Sebastian that they're making roughly £900 million in profit in the UK, but that is only part of the story. Simply put, making tobacco products is tremendously profitable across the world. So in 2018, the most recent year for which I have all of the suitable figures, we identified that the world's 6 largest cigarette manufacturers made combined profits of 55 billion American dollars. Now that is an astronomically large sum, and to put that in context, we can say that Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, Mondelez, FedEx, General Mills, Starbucks, Heineken and Carlsberg, 9 well-known international companies, made combined profits of 51 billion American dollars in that very same year. So here we are looking at 9 companies rather than 6, and we are looking at global companies that are responsible for many household names. So PepsiCo, for example, not only sells us Pepsi Cola, but also owns Walker's Crisps in the UK. We know Mondelez owns not only Cadbury's, but they also own Milka, Toblerone, and a variety of other brands. We know that General Mills owns brands like Jolly Green Giant and Old El Paso, many products that we will all have in our kitchen cupboards at home. And yet, even with a larger number of companies and a larger number of brands and products, they are still able to earn less profits globally than the tobacco industry. Next slide, please. So we have an industry that earns a large amount of profit in total, but they also make a large amount of profit in the UK, as we have already heard. Crucially, though, they not only make a large amount of profit in total, but they make a large amount of profit on each of the sales they are able to make. So here on my slide, you can see I've got some figures about profit margin. Profit margin is the slice of the revenue pie that the industry is able to take as profit. And in the UK, Imperial Brands, one of the 2 largest tobacco companies, was able to earn a profit margin of 63.4%. So that means of every £100 the industry is able to earn as revenue, having paid its excise taxes, £63.40 of that is operating profit. That is a massive, massive amount of money. It is a profitability level like no other. So to put it in context, those other global companies that I was talking about before generally earn profit margins in the region of 15 to 16%. Yes, it did vary a bit. So FedEx on that list had the lowest profit margin of 6.5%, and Coca-Cola had the highest profit margin of 26%. But ultimately, you can see we are dealing with an industry that is earning profits that are large, both in terms of the total amount being made and also the total amount they are making for each individual sale. And simply put, they are able to make those profits because of the monopoly-like pricing power that they have in the market. We have 4 large transnational companies operating in the UK market, and together they have about 95% of the market. And within that, the two biggest companies, Imperial and JTI, control more than 81% of the market for factory-made cigarettes and a similar sort of proportion of the market for roll-your-own tobacco. So profits matter because they are large, and they matter because they give the tobacco industry significant resources and a huge incentive to continue to sell tobacco products. They don't want to change the market in any meaningful way because to do so risks these profits, which are larger than they can earn on any other business activity. Next slide, please. So these profits tell us why we need to do something different. Now, if we take a step back and look at other industries in markets like the UK, where companies have monopoly-like pricing power, what we tend to do in those situations is regulate the prices the companies can charge. So this is why the price we all have to pay for our water, for our gas, for our electric is regulated. It is to stop the profits or stop the companies making large potential profits by exploiting consumers who have no choice. And so here, if we are going to allow life-enhancing products like water, gas, and electric to be subject to price regulation, why would we not also do the same thing for a product like tobacco that kills those individuals who use those products? So the point about the polluter pays levy scheme is that we first start by introducing a scheme that would cap the price the industry is able to charge wholesale for its products. That is importantly going to do two things. Firstly, a low price the industry can charge is going to address the huge profits that they can earn, because broadly speaking, lower prices means lower profits. So we are going to do something about this profit-based incentive to keep selling tobacco products. Secondly, that lower price is going to have a large number of wider health benefits because it is going to stop the tobacco industry using price as a weapon. It would stop this huge range of prices in the marketplace where they can increase the price of the most expensive brands by almost 50% compared with those brands that they want to keep cheap in the marketplace. So price would be removed as a selling tactic, and therefore tobacco would become more of a commodity product, which means it would be easier to tax. Excise tax would become more effective. If we were to stop there, though, that would be hugely problematic because lower wholesale prices would mean lower retail prices, and we really don't want the price in the shops going down, because we know higher retail prices is really effective for encouraging individuals not to smoke in the first place or to quit if they were already a smoker. So what we would need to do as a second phase of this polluter pays levy scheme is to introduce a tax uplift, or ideally a new health levy, to compensate for the lower prices the industry is able to charge. Next slide, please. If we do that, we are effectively compensating for the change in industry prices. So here on my slide, you can see I've got two bars. The bar on the left can be thought of as representing the average price for tobacco sales at the moment. The bar on the right could be thought of as representing what would happen when we have this polluter pays levy scheme with price regulation. Ultimately, what we are trying to convey is that all we are looking to do is transfer what was once industry profits into future government revenue via the application of this new health levy. So ultimately, we are not touching with the excise tax that already exists. We are not doing anything about the production costs that exist in the industry. All we are doing is controlling the price the industry is able to charge and transferring the benefit the industry currently gets to society via the advent of this new health levy. Next slide, please. Now, some people, when we talk about this polluter pays levy scheme, will recall back to the UK consulting in 2014, when the UK government consulted on a tobacco levy on tobacco manufacturers. Now, at the time, the UK government decided not to engage further on that possible tobacco levy because of the nature of the levy that were consulted on. It was essentially another form of excise tax on tobacco companies, but it was backwards looking rather than taking place in real time. And they correctly identified that any manufacturer or importer of tobacco products would pass on that levy to consumers in the form of higher industry or in the form of higher retail prices. As a result, the conclusion was that behavioral impacts would take place. People would perhaps give up because tobacco prices were higher, and ultimately it would raise no additional revenue. On this occasion, the polluter pays levy scheme is very different and overcome these problems. In particular, by capping manufacturer prices, we are therefore capping profits the industry is able to earn. And so we are, by definition, preventing the industry from passing it on to consumers. This is also something that is relatively newly possible. When we were part of the EU, the ability to engage in this price control of tobacco prices was somewhat contested by the EU Tobacco Tax Directive, but now we are no longer subject to that. We now have the ability to more directly engage in tobacco prices. Similarly, as I've said already, the whole point here is to make sure the lower price is only felt by the industry, not by those in the shops. So by adding in this additional tax, this health promotion levy, we are making sure that the retail price does not change, and therefore it is only the industry that feels the effects rather than smokers in the form of materially changed retail prices for all smokers. Clearly, there would be some changes for some smokers. The whole point is to reduce the price gap that exists between this price of £12.30 and the price of £18 and more that we currently see in the shops. Finally, we would also have a strong, clear incentive for the industry to move away from selling smoked tobacco products, because by addressing the profitability they are earning, we are taking away the key incentive they have to engage in the sale of these products. Next slide, please. So, how is the scheme going to work in practice? Well, to start with, we need a way of setting the price caps that would apply to the wholesale tobacco prices. That would need to take place in the same way that we have a regulator that sets the price of water or gas or electric, all of these existing utility products that are subject to price controls. The choice of where that takes place is a political choice for the government. So, for example, the Department for Health and Social Care could be the body that sets that price. They could monitor tobacco company profits and production costs. They could set the prices. They could set any loopholes that the industry finds and address those if it so wishes. And we know they have this expertise because they already do this for a scheme of pharmaceutical medicine. The tobacco industry is much simpler than pharmaceutical medicine because this is a product, tobacco, that is relatively simple to produce. So we need a political decision about the regulator, and there are choices to be made there. But whoever is in place, that regulator is going to cap the price the industry is able to charge based on the cost of production and a reasonable amount of profit that would be in line with the profits that other comparable industries are able to charge. As an illustration, I've given the figure of a 10% profit figure. That is the sort of broad average that we see in other consumer staples. But basically, it would be a way of recognizing that the industry has invested money in their production facilities, and legally we would be obliged to allow them to make some profit on that investment. Fundamentally, though, by lowering the price that the industry is able to charge and by replacing that with a health promotion levy, we would be able to raise hundreds of millions of pounds annually by offsetting the reductions that would need to take place in the wholesale, but crucially not the retail price. We have estimated that this could raise hundreds of millions of pounds annually, and I've got some figures in a minute to sort of give you a feel of the size of the money that could be raised over a number of years. Fundamentally, though, it is important to understand the difference that is existing here between the retail environment and the wholesale environment. By fixing the price that the industry can charge at the wholesale level, we would not penalize the profits that the distributor or the retailer could earn on the sale of tobacco, and hence those parts of the tobacco industry could not be used to try to argue against this as a scheme, because those other parts, retailers would not be directly affected in the same way. Now, when it comes to the application of these capped prices, the government would have some choices to make in terms of the speed of application and the level of desired market impact that any price cap scheme could have. So, for example, one of the key goals of such a scheme would be to increase the price of the cheapest products. It would probably be politically difficult for instantly to raise the price of a £12 pack of cigarettes to £18 overnight. So it is probable that the scheme would need to be phased in over a number of years to make the uplift in prices politically acceptable. So there would need to be choices about the desired speed of application, and in particular about the price spread that would be acceptable over time and how quickly that would need to be reduced. And hence there could be choices about whether we want to target the mean price, the most expensive price, or the cheapest price in the market. Ultimately, though, whatever political choices need to be made in that environment need to balance the effectiveness of the scheme with what is politically acceptable. Ultimately, the end point would be the same, and that is the idea that we would have a single price cap that would apply to each individual product. We would have a levy that would apply to each individual product, and ultimately that is going to generate all of this tax revenue, and it is going to address the pricing power of the industry in the marketplace. Now, I'm an economist by background, not a legal expert, but I'm reliably told it isn't a particularly complicated scheme to apply from a legal perspective. Primary legislation would be needed, but we are talking about just a few clauses that would give the Secretary of State for Health pricing power to regulate the tobacco industry. This could therefore be easily added to something like the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, where the detail would then come in secondary legislation, like we expect there to be future detail in the future, applying the powers that the Tobacco and Vapes Bill is going to give the government in terms of things like flavors for vaping products, for example. Next slide, please. Now, clearly, the devil is always in the detail when it comes to schemes such as this. And so in order to illustrate the nature of the proposal, I have been involved in some modelling work with a team from the University of Sheffield, where we have used the Sheffield Tobacco and Alcohol Policy Model for England, the basic model that has been used to do all of the official modelling on things like minimum unit pricing for alcohol in Scotland, and where that model has been verified as being reasonably accurate, because the results they get for things like the tobacco duty escalator very much aligns with the formal Treasury models that are used to predict the likely outcomes when duty is increased in the budget. Now, I don't really have time to talk about that model in great detail, but basically what that model looks to do is explore the life dynamics of smoking and alcohol use It includes how consumers and retailers respond to price changes, and in the particular case of the work done herein, what we did was compare what would happen if we were to apply such a polluter pays levy scheme to a business as usual case. So here in the numbers I'm going to show you in a minute, the comparative case is one where we have the current 2% real term duty escalator. So in other words, it was telling us what would change going forward if we had the polluter pays levy scheme added on to what we currently see with the future trajectory the government has announced with the commitment to the tobacco tax duty escalator. Next slide, please. So here is a slide of results, and I'm not expecting you to understand what all of these numbers sort of mean. If you could press next slide, please. I want to highlight in particular two areas of numbers that are relevant. So you can see in that box that I've just highlighted, we are exploring the tobacco duty and the VAT that would be raised over a 5-year period from 2025 to 2029. And you can see on the very left, the control case is that we would raise £56 billion in tax revenue over this period. What the numbers next to it mean are the additional tax revenue that could be raised if we apply a polluter pays levy. So for example, if we apply a very restrictive hard cap with a very low wholesale price, and we do that immediately in one big bang, we could expect to raise an additional £4.9 billion through the polluter pays levy. On the other hand, if we do something a bit softer and do a more phased approach, you can see that we would raise just £1.1 billion over that same period of time in terms of additional revenue. So we can see that we are dealing with a scheme that could potentially raise a very large amount of money, up to almost £1 billion in additional revenue every year. And crucially, that money will come from the tobacco industry, not from typical smokers. So if you could put the next slide, please, you can see that I'm flagging a second box. And this is the mean spending that we would expect a typical smoker to make per week. And you can see that on our baseline scenario, the typical expenditure would increase from £41 to £43. But actually, those numbers don't change very much, generally by a few pence, if we apply this polluter pays levy scheme. And quite often, in some scenarios, such as the hard cap immediately applied, we would actually see a reduction in the mean spending on tobacco from a typical smoker because of the way the individual smokers would respond to the higher prices that would be charged. Final thing to note on this, next slide please, is that we would be able to see some benefits from the policy itself. So these benefits you can see are in terms of the number of deaths that would be averted, the number of life years that would be saved, the number of fewer hospital admissions that we would get. Crucially, the important thing to note with these numbers is that it does not include any benefits that would accrue from the spending of the polluter pays levy. So what we would expect is that actually the benefits would be greater because there would be more funds available to help people quit tobacco, and therefore we would expect to see even fewer hospital admissions, even more life years saved. So we are dealing with a scheme here that will raise lots of money for government, that will not involve the typical smoker having to pay more money in a meaningful sense, but ultimately will create large benefits to society. Next slide, please. Final thing I want to say, and I know I've gone over time, so apologies for that, is to talk about this very complicated looking graph. Whoops. Now this graph, I'm sure doesn't mean anything to many of you, but let me tell you how to look at it. This graph shows the distribution of the price of tobacco we currently see in the market. And if you look at the black line, what you can see is that tobacco is sold at a lot of different price points. That is the industry using price as a selling tactic They want to keep some tobacco cheap to make sure that individuals can start to use tobacco and have a very weak incentive to quit. Whereas they also want those who are not price sensitive to pay a very high price for tobacco so the industry can make the maximum possible amount of profit. What the coloured lines are showing is the impact of a price cap. And if you look at the red line shows the hardest possible cap. And you can see effectively tobacco sales would take place at 2 points in the distribution. There would be a whole host of relatively cheap tobacco sales at the level of 35 pence, which would represent roll your own tobacco. So that is people hand rolling cigarettes. And you can see at a price of 65 pence, that would be all of the people using factory made cigarettes. So you can see the price distribution is getting compressed by this policy. And crucially, it would send a very clear signal to government that they are undertaxing roll your own tobacco. So it would allow the government to take issue with wider product-based differential pricing in the market, as well as brand level differential pricing that we currently see the industry using. So if I can say next slide, please, and just finish at that point. I know that's quite a lot of information to take in quite a short time. So I would encourage you to put any questions you may have into the chat, and we'll have plenty of time, I hope, to talk about those after Hazel has taken over. So over to you, Hazel.
Thanks, Rob. And I mean, there was a great deal of rich information there, and I am going to try and take us through how we might take some of that kind of complex background that Rob's provided there, and think about how we might communicate that to other stakeholders in the system who we want to help us make change. So if we move on to my first slide, I think it's just, so I'm going to cover kind of three things. The level of public support for a levy on the tobacco industry, some thoughts around how we might frame our arguments, and then what the kind of current opportunities are and the actions that we could take as a community to try and move this agenda forward. So I'm going to start by looking at public support if we move to my next slide. Basically, the summary of my next couple of slides is that this is an incredibly popular policy. Putting a levy on the tobacco industry, we've polled on it through our YouGov survey for a long time. It's always been very comprehensively supported, and you can see here that it's supported by voters across the political spectrum. The blue line is the level of support, and the grey is the level of opposition, and the level of opposition is very low. So if you to my left side, even among on the next slide, even among smokers, there's a majority support, and again, opposition is fairly low. So over half of smokers support this policy, and fewer than 20% oppose it. So it's really popular. If we move to my next slide, why is it that this kind of approach polls so well? So first of all, I think it's pretty clear, something that raises money and places that revenue raising burden onto businesses rather than onto individuals is something that is very likely to poll well at the moment. In other work that we've done at ASH in collaboration with the Obesity Health Alliance and the Alcohol Health Alliance, we've kind of delved into how the public feel about the role of big business in health. And it's clear from that work that there's very low trust in big business currently, and there's particularly low trust in big tobacco. We've seen that across the decades that we've been surveying the public around tobacco issues. I mean, there's very strong support for keeping them out of the policy making process, really strong support for politicians refusing hospitality, and so on and so forth. This is not an industry that is trusted in the context that big businesses is generally not trusted currently by large parts of the population. And it's also delivering funding which is important to something that the public want to see. So the public want to see an end to smoking, and the framing of this levy as raising revenue to deliver on that goal is, I think, important. And the other insights that we've taken from work that we've done elsewhere is that the public really understand that the government should and must take action to end smoking, that it's not something that will happen inevitably. It's not something that's just about the level, just about individuals. It's something that government should intervene around. So I think bringing all these things together is what makes the levy a popular measure for the public. And I've got a couple of slides that further illustrate that. My next one, Rachel. So this is about the level of support for creating a smoke-free country from our most recent survey. So 65% of the population share the goal that we have to create a smoke-free country, and again, opposition is low. And then on the next slide just illustrates the extent to which the public really support government action. So this yellow line at the top is the extent to which the public think that the government's not doing enough to address smoking. And you can see that over the decades in which we've done a great deal of tobacco control policy, tobacco control legislation, public support goes up and remains high for government intervention. So, you know, the public are well primed to support this kind of measure. So move to my next slide. So it's also clear that we really need further funding to reduce smoking. So I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but the headline really is that while tobacco costs public finances a great deal in this country, the argument that revenue from tobacco taxes somehow offsets that is clearly not the case. And while the government has committed in this financial year to invest in the region of 280 million across the NHS, local government and the Department of Health, our estimate is that for optimal reductions in smoking prevalence during this Parliament, we need to see that go up to something like 377 million, and which would deliver returns in this Parliament. So there's a really strong case for the current investment and for further investment, which could clearly be resourced by a levy on the tobacco industry. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the opportunities right now? So this is Baroness Merran. Back in March 2022, Baroness Merran was on the opposition benches as opposed to on the government benches, where she is now as the government health minister in the House of Lords. And she backed a amendment to a bill which required the government to consult on an tobacco industry levy. That amendment was passed in the House of Lords, although removed in the House of Commons and lost through that ping-pong process. But the fact that Baroness Merran is now on the government benches and is on the record as having supported a consultation in the past is clearly an opportunity as we move into the Lords stages of the Tobacco and Vapes Bill. So if you move to my next slide. At at second reading in the House of Lords, I think 10 of the 60 peers who spoke raised the importance of a tobacco industry levy with Baroness Merran, and an amendment has been tabled, led by Lord Young and supported by Lord Renard and Baroness Finlay, to introduce a similar amendment to the amendment that was tabled previously in the House of Lords and passed, to require the government to consult on a levy. So this will be debated at committee stage. It could be pushed to a vote at third reading. So clearly here's an opportunity here for us all to show our support for this measure and to see if we can secure a government concession to consult on an industry levy. If we move to my next slide. I think it's also important to note the kind of current fiscal context. So there's been, I won't go into all of the ins and outs of what's been going on in government around the kind of fiscal position, but the government has moved from a position where anything that could be deemed as possibly being seen as a tax and was completely off the table. Clearly there's a shift in narrative from the government, and they will be looking at different ways to raise revenue as they come towards the next budget. So here again, an opportunity for us to kind of push the opportunity to raise really significant amounts of money each year from a levy on the tobacco industry in a way that is popular and does not place a burden on individuals. My next slide. I think it's also important to note that, places like the IPPR, we're great to have Seb here today, have supported a levy on the tobacco industry, as well as many of the leading health charities who I know are on here today, Cancer Research UK, British Heart Foundation, Asthma and Lung, Royal College of Physicians, and so on and so forth. And this here is a blog which we'll make sure we circulate afterwards as well, on the Social Market Foundation website, from former Treasury official Mark Lloyd, again talking about the opportunity to place a levy on the tobacco industry and how that might work. My next slide. Make sure we leave enough time for some questions. So just to kind of encapsulate, how it is we want to talk about what could be otherwise seen as a fairly kind of complex measure. So I think the key messages that we want to communicate to politicians, be they local or national, is that a levy is publicly popular. It's needed, wanted, workable. So this is something that will that would give us the funding that we need to deliver on a smoke-free country. It's massively supported by the public, and it's workable. I mean, Rob's we could make that happen, but clearly tobacco companies can afford it. And the way in which we might want to describe that levy is something that is about a cap on big tobacco's prices and a way to limit their profits. It would give us the needed revenue to create a smoke-free country, and it would prevent the tobacco industry from manipulating prices in a way that keeps people smoking. So my final slide is just a kind of to throw it over to those of you on the call who are looking to take some action to support this. I hope that you might feel from today that you might be able to reach out to politicians that are linked to you locally or nationally, MPs, peers, communicating to the Secretary of State and the Chancellor your support, your organisation's support for a levy on the tobacco industry. I know that we've got lots of people here at local level, and you'll be familiar with our local cost calculator, which is a little picture there, the Ready Reckoner tool, and being able to engage with elected members around what the costs are locally and the way in which a levy on the tobacco industry might allow you to address those locally. And also, I hope that people will feel they have the confidence to communicate to the public and the media your organisation's support for this type of model. And hopefully we can get sufficient momentum behind this measure to get the government to consult on it and move forward in the next little bit of time. So speaking of a little bit of time, I think that's my last slide, and it's probably over to Seb for questions.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much for very, very comprehensive presentations. We do have a little bit of time left for questions, so I'm going to try to do them. So there's one to Rob and then one to Hazel, but do keep them coming because I'll hopefully get in as many as possible. I'm going to give the first question to Rob, which is about the statistics that are used in this space. There's a question in the chat about the way in which other organizations like the Institute for Economic Affairs will say that profitability statistics are wrong and point to figures published by tobacco companies as evidence that they are profitable. How should we respond to that?
I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I think the answer is the industry has a particular interest in hiding the profits that they make. They are very good at using the international system to park profits in locations where they're subject to low taxation. And ultimately, I would say the industry has stopped reporting much of the information when we started getting interesting. So Imperial Brands used to report the profit they made in the UK in their main report. And then when I started writing about it, suddenly they decided to report in a different way. So if the industry has nothing to hide and thinks they're making less profits than we think they are, why don't they report and tell us what they're really making? I'm reasonably confident that the information we have is broadly accurate. Ultimately, only they have the information. The government knows the situation, and I'm very confident that we are talking about the right sort of level of profitability for the industry in the UK.
Brilliant. And perhaps more strengthening on transparency over industry profit would be helpful too. I'm going to go to Hazel. I'm going to splice two questions together, which I hope people don't mind. But the question is really about timescale. So do we have time to include relevant clauses around levy in the tobacco and vapes bill? And within that question, I suppose, is it possible within the bill that you could have a strict stipulation that any levy goes back into supporting current smokers to quit?
Yes, I think that the opportunity from this legislation is to get the government to commit to consult, and that the tobacco and vapes bill itself might not be the vehicle for the levy legislation, but it wouldn't be complicated to put in a future finance bill. There are other legislative vehicles that would be a good fit for something on an industry levy. I think there are other time pressures around the kind of content of the legislation that might, the tobacco and vapes bill, that might make it more challenging to get the actual nuts and bolts of a levy into that. What was the second part of the question, Seb?
So the second part of the question was about could you stipulate a kind of hypothecated approach, basically?
Well, obviously there are all sorts of different ways that you could do this. So you could end up with a piece of legislation that would stipulate this, or you could do it in a different way, and you could have government take kind of price control powers in a form of legislation, and then have a policy position that hypothecated the funding. I think the really crucial thing is that government takes forward a consultation on the different options on how this could happen. I'd be interested in your thoughts as well, Rob, because I think that's what's needed. We had this consultation that was back in oh my god, the year's gone out of my head, 2014. Rob, thanks. And it kind of didn't take account of all, even at the time, it didn't, I think, fully take account of all of the things that we were advocating for. But certainly the thinking around how such a model could work has evolved quite considerably. And one of the other things I didn't put in my slide is that we do have other jurisdictions which have moved forward with levy type models. Again, certainly not identical to the model that Rob outlined, but still kind of proof of principle. So we had the user fee in the US, which has been in place for a long time, raising revenue, but also the more recently, Canada has got a similar model that they put in place to levy funding off the tobacco industry. So I think all of this together, it's like now would be an excellent time for the government to re-consult on this issue and identify the answer to some of those more technical questions about how you would do it in practice.
Brilliant. I'll also let Rob reflect on that if he wants, but I'm going to throw in another question, which I think will be of some interest, which is about essentially a minimum unit pricing approach to tobacco and charge on retailers instead. About kind of whether there's a missed opportunity here in going for a levy rather than that kind of approach. Be interested in Rob's thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you. I think Hazel sort of answered well the first question, so I'll concentrate on that newer question, if I may. So I mean, it's quite easy to respond to the question, I think, and the issue I have with minimum unit pricing is you are forcing the price up at the lower end of the market. That is helpful in some sense because more expensive is always better because it is deterring people. The trouble is the benefit of that higher price goes to the industry rather than the government, because you are making the industry price at a level, you are not taking away the pricing ability. So there's an issue. It doesn't really address profitability, which I think is a lost opportunity. It doesn't raise any extra government revenue, which is a lost opportunity. And more importantly, the industry is still able to charge prices higher than that if they wish. So they still have the ability to use price more broadly to manipulate the market. So absolutely, it's better than not using it, but it's certainly a missed opportunity if we were to use that rather than something else. The wider point about retailers, I think, is a fair one, but we have to remember that retailers make very little profit by selling tobacco products. It is the manufacturers who make the profit rather than the retailers, and they're almost obliged to continue to selling products in the tobacco space because of the influence the tobacco industry has. So if we address the profit of the manufacturers, we are addressing a lot of the concerns that exist in the marketplace, and we're stopping the retailer, I think, being used as sort of cannon fodder because they always get held up as, oh, corner shops are going to close, etc. And by taking away that argument, you're just taking away a lot of the industry's ability to argue against it as a suitable policy measure.
Yeah, I would just, on the retailer stuff, there's good evidence now from colleagues in Edinburgh and elsewhere on the profit margins of retailers, which are pretty narrow for tobacco compared to other products, but also that footfall has fallen as well in recent years for tobacco. That was the other argument, that retailers had to have these products because that was what drove people into the shop, but footfall is far lower than it used to be in relation to tobacco. So I just agreeing with Rob really and adding a bit of colour.
Brilliant. There's a few more questions that are quite technical about the levy, so I'll give Rob a bit of a workout on some other points. So these are really about the way in which industry might respond from in a kind of technical sense. The first question is about is the production cost a fixed price, or is there a risk that in trying to maximize profit, industry would further squeeze farmers to reduce production costs?
Okay, so an excellent question again. I think it's important to understand that production costs of tobacco products are incredibly low. Although we're seeing tobacco 20 cigarettes sold in the UK for what, 12 to 18 pounds, they actually cost just a few pence to make. I think a reasonable estimate would be less than 30 pence for a pack of 20 cigarettes. So the actual value in cigarette sales that goes to tobacco farmers incredibly low. You know, you're looking at 1 pence for the cost of leaf, if that, I would guess. So yes, you're right to query this issue of production costs. But the industry has an incentive at the moment to have production costs as low as possible because that maximizes their profits today. And that would not change in an environment of price caps. So the risk to farmers, I think, would be negligible. It wouldn't materially change the situation today. And even if they did manage to sort of, extract even lower prices from tobacco farmers, the regulator would simply take that into account when they refresh tobacco prices and said, oh, well, your production costs have gone down, so should your retail price. So the industry would not have any changed incentive to change what they do in terms of production. So I don't think it is a particular concern that we need to worry about in that sense.
Brilliant. I think we have time for one more question. I know that Stephanie has put a lot of questions in the chat, so I will bring in one of them. But I suppose the main one for me from this list, and it's an argument that Treasury often make, which is about the cost of setting up taxation or levy schemes, which is, do the figures on possible benefit include accounting for cost to set up and run such a scheme? Or when that argument is made, how should we respond to it?
Okay, so as I've said already, the tobacco is not a complicated scheme. So this is not a scheme that would cost a large amount of money. As I noted already, DHSE has the expertise. It already has a team of people doing this for pharmaceutical products. So it isn't going to be expensive. So I don't think we need particularly worry about the cost of setting up the scheme. It's sort of part of the usual costs of government. Yes, if we decided to create a new independent regulator, akin to Ofwat, Ofgem, etc., there would be some cost in setting that up. But off smoke, as we could sort of call it, wouldn't necessarily need to be complicated. It wouldn't need many people. So within the context of raising hundreds of millions of pounds, we're not looking at anything material that would change the needle in that regard. In regard to a sort of wider question I saw from Stephanie in the chat in terms of the power of the tobacco industry, the beauty of this scheme is that it would apply to all tobacco products sold in the UK, whether they were made here or imported. And in actual fact, virtually all tobacco into the UK market is imported now. And therefore, it wouldn't matter how the industry tried to locate their international operations to avoid tax, that price cap would apply, and the industry accepts it and sells its products in the UK at that price, or they say, oh, I don't like that price, and they don't sell, and therefore they make zero profits. So I don't think we need to worry about, complicated international tax avoidance measures, because physically the products arrive at the border and we can say what price they can charge from that point. And that would be based purely on the cost of production. And yes, if they make the product in Poland, they would have to provide information on their Polish production costs. But that wouldn't change the nature of the scheme in itself.
Brilliant. Well, I have promised to keep to time, and it is now 1 o'clock, but I'd just like to say a huge thank you to both Rob and Hazel for incredibly interesting presentations, and to everyone for attending for an interesting bunch of questions, which I'm sure have given us all plenty to think about. Thank you so much for Ash for hosting the webinar, and really keen to keep the conversation going about a levy and see how we can all work together to make this happen. So thank you very much. I'll bring this to a close, and have a lovely day.